We are still in the Gospel of Luke, and so we are actually going to be in Luke chapter 8 today. So if you would like to follow along in your Bibles, we will be in Luke 8. We're going to start at verse 22, and we're going to read a lot of Luke, because like we've been saying, we want to finish by the time we get to Easter. On Easter, we want it to be Easter, so we're only in Luke 8. I think there's 24 chapters in Luke, and Easter is in next month at the end. So we're actually going to be looking at the miracles of Jesus Christ. We're going to look at the miracles this week and next week. Some of the instances from the other Gospels besides Luke that Jesus did include turning water into wine, walking on water, finding a coin in the mouth of a fish. And I think to us in 2013, those all look like magic tricks, don't they? I mean, for most people today, they have a tendency to not believe in miracles. If something seems impossible, we'll say, it would take a miracle. And we don't mean it would take God to make it happen. We mean it's never going to happen. But you see, in the time that Jesus walked, miracles were a part of their worldview. Miracles were a part of the expected order of things. Not only did people believe in miracles, they actually looked for them. And according to the gospel stories, Jesus performed many miracles. He worked miracles of nature, he performed exorcisms, he healed the sick and the infirm. I kind of want to break it down like this. Jesus had power. Power over the earth, power over the heavens, power over life, and power over death. And in his ministry, he exercised power over all these different realms, over all these different dominions. Today, we're going to look at his power over earth and the heavens. And next week, we're going to look at his power over life and death. And it's funny how we can view the New Testament as this place where all these amazing miracles take place. But miracles, they're God's method of operation. The Old Testament has no shortage of amazing miracles. Some miracles save an entire nation of people, like when Moses parts the Red Sea. Some miracles, they're personal for only one person, like when like Hezekiah, when he prays that his life would be extended. So when Jesus begins his ministry, the people, they're not naysayers, they're not doubters. They're kind of primed and they're ready to believe. And if you or I, we saw somebody do a miracle, we'd be looking for the trap door. We'd be looking for the invisible rope or the mirror, but in Jesus' day, it was expected. And I think that's kind of great. You know, back then, people expected God to be visible. They expected God to show up. But to be fair, the people at this time, they also believed in other gods. They were superstitious. They also believed in magic. The Greeks worshipped a pantheon of deities. And there are several famous street magicians at this time. And Jesus, he had his fair share of critics. Celsus, the philosopher, said it was by magic that Jesus was able to do miracles which he appeared to have done. Christians get the power which they seem to possess by pronouncing the name of certain demons and incantations. So notice that this historian, he doesn't doubt that Jesus and his disciples did miracles. He just doubts that they were from God. Justin Martyr, he said, "Our Christ healed those who were from birth, were blind and deaf and lame. He cured them by his word, causing them to walk, to hear, and to see, by restoring the dead to life. He compelled the men of that day to recognize him, yet when they saw these things come to pass, people said it was a display of magic art, for they even dared to say that Jesus was a magician and a deceiver of people." And you know, we actually might hear that same argument today, that Jesus did magic tricks, and he made people hallucinate, or he knew things about medicine and alchemy that nobody could have known at that time. In fact, one of Jesus' own miracles involves this very same question. In Luke chapter 11, it says, Jesus was throwing out a demon that causes muteness, and when the demon was gone, the man who couldn't speak began to talk. And the crowds were amazed, but some of them said, "He throws out demons with the authority of Beelzebul, the ruler of demons." Others were testing him, seeking a sign from heaven. So notice that this crowd is skeptical. And some are asking him to perform a miracle to prove his power, and others claim that he gets his power from something called Beelzebul. Beelzebul was has become another name for the devil today, but at the time that this was written, Beelzebul was a Philistine god. 2 Kings 1, the Sumerian king Ahaziah, he fell through his roof and he broke himself. And he was worried that he was going to die, and so he sent an emissary, and he said, "Go and consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, to see if I will recover from this injury." Baal, you'll read about in the Bible that, somebody worshiped Baal. Baal just means Lord, and Zebub means house. So Beelzebub is the Lord of the house. And basically, the crowd isn't saying Jesus' power comes from the devil. They're even going so far as to say his power comes from Gentile gods. It's kind of like a racial slam. They're saying his power isn't even Hebrew. Verse 17 says, because Jesus knew what they were thinking, he said to them, "Every kingdom involved in civil war becomes a wasteland, and a house torn apart by divisions will collapse. If Satan is at war with himself, then how will his kingdom endure? I ask this because you say that I throw out demons by the authority of Beelzebul. Well, if I throw out demons by the authority of Beelzebul, then by whose authority do your followers throw them out?" Little theology kung fu right there. "Therefore they will be your judges. But if I throw out demons by the finger of God, then God's kingdom has already overtaken you." Notice two things here. One, Jesus does admit that there are other disciples that are not his that exorcise demons, right? That cast out demons. So again, these people, they live in a world where they expect to see miracles. And two, Jesus literally says that he drives out demons with the finger of God, a phrase they would know from the Hebrew Scriptures. Exodus 31 says the 10 Commandments were cut by the finger of God. Jesus says he cast out demons with the same appendage that gave them the law. And Jesus says, if that's the case, well, then you're already in the presence of God's kingdom. A few weeks ago, we talked about the gospel, and we said that oftentimes Jesus did actions. He performed miracles, and they were visible, and they were physical examples of God's kingdom here on earth. And you and I, we might think that we're all alone in the universe, only 91 million miles away from the sun, and so we think we own this floating sphere made of dirt and water, all 24,000 miles of it. But when Jesus shows up, all these components of the earth, they all obey him. They all move when he tells them to. He talks to them as if these things belong to him. In Luke chapter 9, Jesus feeds 5,000 people, and he does it by taking natural elements like wheat and water and fish meat, and he is able to multiply it. He's able to clone it, right? He can take the molecules and atoms that they're composed of, and he can make more. Last week, when we read about the calling of the disciples, Jesus performs a miracle in Luke 5, this huge catch of fish, right? For years, scientists have been trying to learn to talk to dolphins because they've seen that these mammals, they communicate with each other just using a speech pattern that they think is similar to humans. But Jesus is able to speak to red-bellied tilapia, and he's able to convince hundreds of them to swim into a net. The earth obeys Jesus. And I want to show you an example of this in Luke chapter 8. Luke chapter 8, verse 22 says this: "One day Jesus and his disciples boarded a boat, and he said to them, 'Let's cross over to the other side of the lake.' So they set sail, and while they were sailing, he fell asleep. Gale-force winds swept down on the lake. The boat was filling up with water, and they were in danger. So they went and woke Jesus, shouting, 'Master, Master, we're going to drown!' But he got up, gave orders to the wind and the violent waves, and the storm died down, and it was calm. And he said to his disciples, 'Where is your faith?' And so filled with awe and wonder, they said to each other, 'Who is this? He commands even the winds and water, and they obey him.'" Now, the word obey right there is the Greek word hypokao. Hypo means under, like where we get hypodermic, and aku means to listen, like where we would get acoustic. So the word has the second understanding of perhaps a servant who listens for your doorbell. It's kind of weird. The word ends up meaning under authority or under obedience. The disciples say the wind and the waves are subservient to Jesus. A little biblical refresher to go back even way to the beginning. Luke, our author, right, is a Greco-Syrian physician who lives in the Greek city of Antioch in ancient Syria. So you're all caught up. You're like, that makes sense. Yes, I'm right there with you. It's just over jump from Iraq. Yeah. The Greek language was probably his primary language since he's very prolific. He's a very detailed author. There are over 700 Greek words that only appear in Luke that don't appear anywhere else in the Bible. Luke knows a lot of really big words. We also know Luke was a physician, and so we conclude he was educated. He had some working knowledge of medicine and maybe anatomy. And in Luke 1:3, our author gives a little backstory on why he wrote this book. He says, "Now, after having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, I have also decided to write a carefully ordered account for you, most honorable Theophilus." Notice that we have a Greek doctor who has investigated the stories, and he has set out to write an orderly account. This is a man who knows something about science. He is going to comment on miracles of Jesus. Luke's gospel is a testimony to the power and the lordship of Jesus, and the author is a Greek physician. We've been reading for 2 months. Does Luke strike you as a person who recognizes Jesus' power and lordship? Yeah, he does. And also notice, Luke says his story is for someone named Most Honorable Theophilus. So it sounds as though Luke is telling the story to someone, and he calls this person Most Honorable. So most scholars, they have 2 different theories. One is that Theophilus was a Roman official who witnessed Jesus' trial and execution. Most honorable is a Roman greeting. That's something you would call another Roman. And Luke's book seems to be all about Christ's innocence. So he might have written it as a chance to share the gospel with a prominent Roman citizen. The other theory is that Theophilus is you. The name Theophilus breaks down as Theo, God, and Philo, love. Literally, it means those who love God. The name Theophilus could be Luke's way of saying, this book, it's written for you who believe. It's written for you who love God. In other words, to any person. So let's go back to the storm on the sea. Luke lives in a Greek world, and the disciples say in Luke chapter 8, "Who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him." You and I, we read this, and we're confused because we think the disciples are stupid. After all, they've watched Jesus heal people. They've watched Jesus cast out demons. They should know he has power, right? Yeah, but as we saw earlier, there were other disciples at the time who could heal and cast out demons. They lived in a world where they expected to see miracles. Sure, I mean, they didn't see them all the time. It wasn't like an everyday thing, but they still lived in a world where it was common enough. But this is different. Jesus just rebuked a storm. I mean, that's not even in the same ballpark. Healing and exorcisms, that's people. But this is the earth. Luke records that Jesus is in charge of the winds and the waves. Now, why is that significant? Well, technically today, we know that it's all the wind, right? The water isn't doing anything. It's just reacting to wind. Well, in the Greek world, they separated the dominion of water and weather. First, we have the Theoi Uranian. They are the gods of the sky. They are all under the service of Zeus and Hera, the king and queen of the heavens. And there are 43 separate deities who control the sky and the heavens. You have the Harpies, Helios, and all the gods that our planets are named after. And in the other corner, we have the Theoi Helon. These are the Greek gods who control the sea. They were ruled by Poseidon and Triton, the Sirens, Oceanus. There are 66 different deities who control the sea and the waves. So in the Greek world, there are literally over 100 gods who could be blamed for a storm. 100 gods that you would pray to be released from a storm. So when you're in fear for your life and you're afraid you're going to die, in that moment, who do you decide to pray to? Right? Who have you offended? Maybe you didn't. Maybe that guy did. You have no idea. Jesus jumps in. He quiets an entire storm with a word. And in verse 24, it says Jesus gave orders to nature, and it obeyed. And the disciples say, "Who is this?" The Bible says Jesus rebuked nature. He gave orders to the wind and the rain. I want to show you a few other places where Jesus displays the same authority. In Luke chapter 4, verse 31, it says, Jesus went down to the city of Capernaum in Galilee and taught the people each Sabbath. They were amazed by his teaching because he delivered his message with authority. A man in the synagogue who had a spirit of an unclean demon screamed, "Hey, what do you have to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come here to destroy us? I know who you are. You are the Holy One from God." "Silence," Jesus said, speaking harshly to the demon. "Come out of him." And the demon threw the man down before them, and then came out of him without harming him. In Luke chapter 9, it says, the next day when Jesus, Peter, John, and James had come down from the mountain, a large crowd met Jesus. A man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to take a look at my son, my only son. A spirit seizes him, and without any warning it screams, it shakes him, and causes him to foam at the mouth. It tortures him, and rarely leaves him alone. And I begged your disciples to throw it out, but they could not." Jesus said, "You faithless and crooked generation, how long will I be with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." And while he was coming, the demon threw him down and shook him violently, and Jesus spoke harshly to the unclean spirit and healed the child and gave him back to his father. And everyone was overwhelmed by God's greatness. Notice Luke records Jesus speaks harshly to demons and to sickness, just like a parent would do, just like a master would do. After Jesus calms the storm in Luke 8, in verse 26, it says, Jesus and his disciples sailed to the Garrison land, which is across the lake from Galilee. And as soon as Jesus got out of the boat, a certain man met him. The man was from the city and was possessed by demons, and for a long time he had lived among the tombs, who was naked and homeless. And when he saw Jesus, he shrieked and fell down before him, and then he shouted, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, don't torture me." And he said this because Jesus had already commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. Again, notice, Jesus speaks to this demon army as their general. Who's in charge? Who gives orders? Jesus does. The Bible says many times it had taken possession of him, so he would be bound with leg irons and chains and placed under guard, but he would break his restraints. And the demon was forced into the wilderness, and Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "Legion," he replied, because many demons had entered him. And they pleaded with him not to order them to go back to the abyss. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the hillside, and the demons begged Jesus to let them go into the pigs. Jesus gave them permission, and the demons left the man and entered the pigs. The herd rushed down the cliff into the lake and was drowned. And when those who tended the pigs saw what happened, they ran away and told the story in the city and in the countryside. People came to see what had happened, and they came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had gone. He was sitting at Jesus' feet, fully dressed, completely sane, and they were filled with awe. And these people, who had actually seen what had happened, told them how the demon-possessed man had been delivered. Then everyone gathered from that region of the Gerasenes, and they asked Jesus to leave because they were overcome with fear. The miracles we read about are literally Jesus giving instructions to the realms of heaven and earth, and those two realms obey him. No question. It could be the weather, it could be inanimate objects like bread, or it could be supernatural beings. It doesn't matter. You know, when you watch the cop shows, you'll always hear some cop who's above the law. They try to muscle their way somewhere, and then some other cop will say, "Hey, you have no jurisdiction here," right? Jurisdiction is Latin. It breaks down as juris, which means law, and discern, which means speak. In other words, jurisdiction is the ability to speak law. Remember what Jesus told his critics? He commands with the finger of God, the same finger that wrote the law, the same finger that carved the Ten Commandments. Does Jesus have jurisdiction in the heavenly realms? Yeah, he does. Does Jesus have jurisdiction on the earthly realms? Yeah, he does. Jesus says in Luke chapter 10, all things have been committed to me by my Father. The Greek word for all things means all things. Go figure. Matthew 28, Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And although it doesn't look like it, the stories of Jesus calming the storm and Jesus casting out the demons, they're linked. Maybe not in language and maybe not in the plot, but just in how Jesus approaches both. Jesus tells things to be quiet, doesn't he? Jesus tells the storm to be quiet. When the demons say they know who Jesus is, he tells them to be quiet. After the wind and the waves calm down, the disciples say, who is this? When the people of the town saw the demon-possessed man dressed and sane, Luke says they were filled with awe. And they asked Jesus to leave. Why? Didn't he just do this great, amazing thing? No, they didn't understand his power. They're afraid of him. Who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him? If we go back to the calming the sea story, I want you to notice something. Jesus had just spent the entire day preaching and doing ministry work. And Luke 8 says, while they were sailing, he fell asleep. Gale-force winds swept down on the lake. The boat was filling up with water, and they were in danger, so they went down and woke Jesus. Now, I'm a light sleeper. If anything rattles the house or makes a noise, y'all have thunder. I'm not. That wasn't me back in California. I wake up just like that. There's a creak in the house, I wake up. Jesus is on a small boat in the middle of a frightening storm, and he's asleep. Why? Because Jesus is exhausted. I think sometimes we don't fully appreciate Jesus' humanity. Philippians chapter 2 says that Jesus came unassumingly, that he set aside his divine attributes, that God became a man, and he did it humbly. And so here, he is absolutely fatigued. He's exhausted. And I can tell you, as a pastor with a ministry that is far less demanding than Jesus's, it does get tiring. I mean, there is a limit to the number of hours you can work. There's a limit to how far you can press yourself. There's even a limit to, even though you love people, how many people you can serve continually. I get tired, but I have modern technology. I have a wife. I have a family. I have a support staff. I can't even imagine the pressure and the ministry of Jesus. Plus, a typical rabbi, you would have a synagogue, and in one of those little small towns, you'd maybe attract 20, 30 people to come to a Torah reading. Jesus has thousands of people that follow him wherever he goes. Jesus is so exhausted, he goes underneath into the hull of a boat. I tell you, when that looks like a good place to sleep, you're tired. Who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him? He's a human. He's a human who gets tired, who feels spent, who has burned energy and needs to recharge. He's a person who feels the pressure and the burden of others and who allows himself to give away his energy when he loves and cares for others. Then we have this huge storm. And we said last week that most of the disciples were fishermen, right? So we can imagine they would have some experience navigating weather, especially on a lake that they're familiar with. But at the end of it all, there is nothing humanly left they can do. So what do? They wake up Jesus. We hate to bother you, and we know you're tired, but funny thing, we're all going to drown in a few minutes, and we just thought you should know. Jesus opens an eyelid, and he shouts an order to the earth, and it obeys him. Jesus looks at his disciples and goes, pfft, closes his eyes and goes back to sleep. Can you imagine a violent storm just stopping and water and waves just calm and quiet, like the boat's not even rocking anymore? Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? Jesus is the perfect combination of God and humanity. And the author of Hebrews sums this up beautifully for us, and I want it to be our meditation as we close today. Hebrews chapter 4 says we have a great high priest who passed through the heavens, who is Jesus, God's Son. Because we don't have a high priest who can't sympathize with our weaknesses. but instead one who was tempted in every way that we are, except without sin. So let's draw near to the throne of favor with confidence so that we can receive mercy and find grace when we need help. The author of Hebrews says we have a Savior who can sympathize with our weaknesses, who understands our temptations and our trials and our storms. The Greeks, they have over 100 gods for wind and water. That's 100 gods to try to make relationships with, pray to, obey, appease. Perhaps 100 gods who don't even give you a second thought. We have one God, a God who loves us, thinks about us, and a God who cared enough for us that he came to earth as a man and experienced life as a man, a God who knows what it's like to be exhausted, a God who understands what it means to work a full day and come home tired. Hebrews says, let's draw near to the throne with confidence so that we can find mercy and grace and help. Do you need help? Do you need a miracle in your life? Because if you do, my advice is that you wake up the person who's in charge. You approach the one who has jurisdiction in all things. You go before the throne for help. Remember, the Hebrews lived in a world where they expected God to show up. They expected God to interact in their lives, and I would argue that we should too. I mean, not to test God like the crowds who were just simply asking Jesus for a sign, but moreover to approach the throne when the storms and the trials come. The last blank in your handout, I have absolutely no answer for. It says, in order to find my miracle, God needs to silence what? What is that for you? Is it the noise of the world? Is it the voice of self-doubt? Do you constantly hear that you're not good enough, not strong enough, not pretty enough, that you don't measure up? Does your value as a person only come from how much money you make or how successful you are? Does Jesus need to silence that? In what part of your life could you really use a miracle? Jesus rebuked wind and waves. Jesus silenced demons and nature, and he did it in order that God's glory would be revealed. I believe a miracle can happen in your life. So what does God need to silence in order that you would see it? Last week we talked about discipleship and what it means to follow Christ. What distraction does God need to silence so that you stay on the right path? Perhaps you've tried everything you could think of, everything humanly possible to stop the wind and the waves, but now you just need someone to tell it all to be quiet. What storms can Jesus silence for you? We're going to take a few minutes in prayer, and I want you to think about that as we bow our heads and consider what it would take.